Welcome to Clear TV. Today we're gonna have the Lauri as our guest, and we're gonna talk about the intuition. Hello Lauri, would you like to tell us about something yourself?
So I'm Lauri. Jarvilehto. I'm a professor of practice at Aalto University, and I've been here now for a little less than 5 years. For that I've been mostly an entrepreneur for 22 years, worked in the music industry for 10 years, then went back to school and got myself a degree and a PhD in philosophy, and then I started my second company called the Philosophy and Academy, or Academic Philosophy, in 2009, and then got into learning games, built a game with Rovio called Angry Birds Solar System that was basically built together with NASA about teaching kids about how the solar system works, and then we started our own learning game studio called Mirror that built this game together with CERN about particle physics and atoms and chemistry and stuff like that. And we figured, like, let's start with an easy topic to teach 5-year-olds, so we'll start with particle physics, and that was a fun project. And then after I ran that company for about 3 years, and then Esa Saarinen asked me to start teaching philosophy at the Aalto University, so I started running this primer course in philosophy here, and then they had this position, and I ended up being in my current role.
Yes, and so we are your former students in the philosophy lecture, so we met with you in this way.
Yeah.
And I would like to start with very simple question on this, what is intuition? We've been discussing today, asking each other about what is intuition, and to be honest, we don't have the clear answer either.
Yeah.
And we've been reading your book to understand what's the things works and everything, reading some extra sources, but I would like to hear what is intuition?
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously there's a ton of different ways you can define intuition. Being leaning a bit towards the academic side of things, I'm partial to the definition that intuition is the non-conscious capability of drawing inference and insight, generating ideas and making decisions. And the emphasis is on non-consciousness. So basically, one of the reasons why I think that there's so much of this kind of esoteric or non-academic leanings in intuition, this kind of spooky, almost like the Force from the Star Wars, just listen to your emotions sort of stuff, is that it kind of feels a bit mysterious, that something just pops into your head and you go like, whoa, that's cool. And then if it actually works out and people start thinking okay, so there must be this some kind of mysterious guidance behind that. Maybe, academically, you can't really rule that out, but the sort of burden of proof is obviously in then generating the evidence about whatever that would be. And frankly, for most of the actual verifiable phenomena attributed to intuition can, in my understanding, already be explained pretty well through research in cognitive psychology, neuroscience, a field called behavioral economics. There's a lot of empirical research that gives us a sort of rough picture of what goes on in the mind and perhaps in the brain when we get these insights. And then we can also, in my book, I ended up crafting a sort of heuristic for deciding when to trust the sort of gut feelings you get, and when actually you should not listen to your emotions, because they're not always a good thing. So that's that.
And we know the feeling, for example, I think people are having in their everyday lives. And I like the example of when you are in the bathroom and you're showering, or you're just using the bathroom, and then there's an idea pops up, and you solve a thing, and then I think this is the intuition in a way.
Yeah.
Because you don't think consciously, but it just pops up.
Yeah.
And I would like to ask you, for example, the role of intuition. For example, while I was coding or doing something else, I'll go to something else and then just figure out the solution and come back. Or in the middle of the night, wake up with a sudden, just feeling of it. Oh, okay, I got it now. And then the question will be what is the role of the intuition generally in our everyday lives and everyday decision making? And okay, sometimes I feel based on this, I behave this way, I behave that way. But in a way, I also behave consciously. And how do they work together, and how does it go?
Yep. I think that's a really important question. Well, first of all, intuition is a part of everyday life. Like actually most human activity is non-conscious by default. So we don't start employing the conscious thinking before we run into something that's not working the way it's supposed to. So like, when you walk or when you come to work or to your class or whatever, like, you don't go like left foot, right foot, left foot. You don't employ conscious thinking about like, getting to places, or even in this conversation, like many of these things, like, when you say something, I may process sort of like, roughly what's the ballpark, but the actual, like what I'm saying now is roughly generated from the stuff that I've been studying and learning throughout the years. So I'm not drawing these words from a kind of a, bucket of words in my mind and like consciously parsing them together, but it's sort of more kind of flowing from what I already know. And the sort of like, the current understanding of how this works is that there's a ton of evidence that the human mind can be, kind of depending on how you measure it and what kinds of research you're running, can be roughly split into two different systems or sets of systems, kind of depending once again on who you ask. Or there's like, Jonathan Evans's idea that it's not actually systems but types of thinking processes. But that's sort of like, the long and the short of it is that without going to the nitty-gritty of the academia, you can talk about these things that Richard Weston and Keith Stanovich coined as System 1 and System 2 back in the day. And so the thinking is that System 2 is the sort of like the conscious capability, or the Type 2 process, if you want to follow Evans, is the kind of like the conscious capability of making explicit decisions, explicit observations about, oh, that's a remote control over there. And then System 1 is basically everything else. And they're not separate systems. So System 2 actually employs, for most everything that's happening consciously, also always has this sort of like below the surface hidden element. So for example, the semantics of the language that we use, we are constantly aware of the actual, like, the sentences and words that we are, sharing. But then, for example, how I employ certain words, and the more, technical words we start employing, the more difficult it becomes, because then it depends on how I've learned to use the words and how you've learned to use the words. And then if the technicalities differ, or like, in political discourse, for example, people often like talk across each other because they actually employ the same symbols, the same words, different ways. But that's sort of like the relationship between System 1 and System 2, that's sort of like, that explains how the sort of like intuitive or non-conscious actions and decisions, and well, there's some academic discussion about what is a non-conscious thought, but like, the non-conscious bit of the thought process at least, they permeate our, like, every single moment of our everyday life, more or less.
There was a question, I think.
Yeah, I like how the conversation went from intuition to the two systems of the brain. And again, during the philosophy course, we did touch up on System 1 and System 2, and I also read Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. It was a really interesting read. Would you consider intuition part of System 1, or would it be a separate entity?
It's definitely a part of like System 1, or like the more kind of specific way to phrase that would be that intuition relies on System 1 processes. And in my book I made a distinction that, because I mean, back in the day, the first model that I built around this was sort of like that we have emotional processes, intuitive processes, and conscious processes. And then I gave a presentation at this event at the House of Science in the center of Helsinki, and then my colleague Frank Martela sort of like offhand after the presentation, everybody was like really keen and like they loved the model, and I was like, yeah, I'm really onto something. And then we're walking down the stairs and Frank goes like, that, yeah, I love that presentation, the model was really cool, but have you thought about it, like, that even when people think consciously, why do they actually do that? It's because they feel that it matters. So don't emotions actually permeate all of these layers of consciousness? And I could just like, immediately like walk, I remember that feeling like, walking down those stairs, and like, I could see the whole model crumbling to pieces, because I had this nice sort of like, this Jane Austen pride and sensitivity, which is in Finnish, järki ja tunteet, because the presentation was in Finnish. So rationality and emotions, that's the Finnish translation. So I had like, Photoshopped like rationality, emotions, and intuition into that picture. And this whole thing blew up in those like, 5 minutes walking downstairs. And then it took me some work to like, to figure out, so what was I actually like after? Why did that model resonate so well with professional philosophers, for example? And it turned out that like actually you can make a distinction like that in System 1, so you can identify processes that are like phylogenetic or something that you're born with, and ontogenetic or something that you've learned, which kind of roughly coincides then with sort of like not the emotional but the instinctive side of non-conscious thinking. So kind of like, if there's a loud bang, we all go, "Ooh, what was that?" And like, if there's a buffet, it's very hard to like, not to take an extra serving of dessert or something like that if you don't really like pay attention to that. Yeah. And so we have these kind of like avoiding dangers, maximizing energy intake, procreation, like all of these things that are built into our DNA that are driving, that actually work really well if we're in the natural state. Like, if we lived in the savannah, like, ooh, chocolate, like, that's a really, really clever survival strategy. But obviously, like, in this environment where there's like an abundance of energy everywhere, it's like not, like, then it's not maybe the best way to do things.
You have to like train yourself, and I think you named that environment as a type 3 in your book.
Yeah, so that's probably, by the way, an important distinction, because Jonathan Evans also makes like type 1, type 2, type 3 distinction, but that's a completely different framework that he employs. Okay. So what I'm talking about is like, that, because I latch on to the sort of like Stanovich, West, Kahneman double system model in my book, and then so I'm talking about the system 3, so like the environment, because there's a lot of research in embodied cognition, like the bodily states, for example, have direct causal effect on how we think. Like that if you're hungry, your emotional states and your cognitive, like your capability of thinking is different than when you're not hungry, and so on and so forth. And there's like, majority of the serotonin production, which is a neurotransmitter attributed with well-being, is actually happening in the gut. So it's kind of like, that if your gut bacteria are kind of skewed, that might actually be a contributing factor to things like ill-being or even depression and things like that. Eat your probiotics, because,
So it really comes from the gut.
Yeah, so basically the well-being of the bacteria living in your gut actually contributes to the clarity of the capability of your thinking. It's just kind of spooky, but that seems to be like, there's a ton of research indicating this. And then when you extend this even further to things like Chalmers and Clark's extended mind hypothesis, and you get to this point where basically anything in your environment can trigger a new thought. And like, especially if you're in an environment like where you have lots of things that generate different types of arousal. So if you, for example, have imagery about, I don't know, concentration camps or something like that, your whole thinking is gonna be different than if you're in a white-walled room, or if you have pictures of serene landscapes. That's gonna affect your thinking differently from, once again, like having white walls. So, and Clark and Chalmers posit that there is actually this sort of like thing called the parity principle. So you can actually replace some parts that we typically do sort of like on current understanding, like some brain-based neural network connection basis. So you can actually like extend that into the environment. So then basically the environment becomes the sort of system 3 in the equation. And how far you can take that analogy, the research is not quite as solid as with the dual processing literature, but it's still kind of like, it can already inform you about it. Like, that the types of environments where you spend your time, and the type of wallpaper you have on your computer or iPad, or like, the places where you work, like, do you go to a noisy place where you're more liable to be distracted from your work, or do you go to a quiet place? So yeah, that kind of like, that influences the way you think, and it influences the thought processes that mostly take place in system 1, so you're not really consciously aware of them, but then something may, when you're showering and you've seen a picture on a wall and that's triggered something in your system 1, and then like Jonathan Evans writes in one of his, actually several of his papers, that system 2 thinking is basically system 1 processes that post their end result into system 2. So there's a convoluted process that goes on that we have absolutely no idea about how they're structured, but then we get the end result, the sort of like the aha, like that, these two things combined in my mind in a certain way, and then you wake up in the middle of the night thinking about, whoa, that's interesting. And there seems to be, there was an interesting thing, a neuroscientist, a friend of mine, Tapani, who used to be the head neuroscientist at Philosophian Academia. So he told me that basically the way, the current understanding about how this all works is that the reason why you wake up in the middle of the night is that if you have a sort of like non-conscious thought process that triggers a kind of a cortisol reaction, so basically triggers a stress reaction in your body, and it increases the cortisol flow in your cortisol quotient in your blood flow. That means that you wake up just simply because you're physiologically in a state of arousal, and you go, I need to remember to call my friend in the morning, or I need to send an email in the morning, or like, if you have a great idea, that may like put you in a different physiological state of arousal. So it's kind of like, that the whole sort of like mental versus physical is really intertwined in this model, because it becomes the same thing at the end of the day.
I like how you mentioned that the emotional state and the like surrounding environment is intertwined with the mental state. Because funnily enough, like yesterday, I went to the gym with Yasser, Neo, and I was very hungry after. And so as soon as I saw like chocolate bars, I was like, I had a very primitive like thought process. It was chocolate, hungry, and I bought 5 of them.
Yeah.
And it was a very simple, like, very straightforward. Hungry, chocolate, buy 5. It's not only when you're hungry. I mean, everyone says like, oh, don't go to the shops when you're hungry. And we all know that's kind of true, because we can see the difference in the bills. The environment can have a massive like impact, because me personally, I cannot like study or work at home. No matter how much I try, I could like go maybe 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And then I cut out. Why do people like have that, where they struggle to like study in certain environments or work in certain environments? Is it more habits, or is there a wider reason?
Yeah, I think it's habituation, and like, when you're at home, you probably have more distractions, so there's kind of, because basically everything in your environment can trigger a thought. And at home you have like, I don't know, if you have a TV, like, you might go, oh, maybe I should, see what's on Netflix, and then when you go to, I don't know, a library or something like that, so then it may be that sort of like an environment is more keyed towards the sort of like thinking that, okay, so I'm here, so I need to study, and then you look at something and that triggers again sort of like, okay, so focus on the studies, so that may be helpful. But it's also interesting that there's no sort of like ideal single environment for everything. It's more like if you need to do some focused work, typically what's a good environment is something that's as distraction-free as possible. So ideally, like, a small meeting room at the university or at the corporation, like, where you can just close the door and it's like there's no posters on the wall or anything. You can just, focus on the work. That's great. But then if you want to do some ideation and some creative work, you need almost the opposite. So you need something with like, colorful walls, and I don't know, like I'd love to have like a pile of Legos on a desk, or something you can like, just fiddle with, and something that actually distracts you a lot, because that can then lead to new kinds of associations and thought processes. And then there's, like you mentioned, habits. So habituation is kind of a key component on how the system 1 is structured. So the more we do a certain type of activity in a certain type of environment, the more we are also like triggered to do that type of activity there. And that's why home and studying might not be the ideal, because you're also like, keyed in to do so many other things when you're at home. Whereas like, if you go to an environment that's only like mostly associated in your system 1 with studying, then that would work better.